Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Chapter 6, Part 1. By the worst luck in the world, it was a day of squalls and rain when Enid and her mother came down for the last week in May. Neville was raging with annoyance. He had decided it was to be a perfectly fine day with a few clouds and a gentle wind, but Providence thought otherwise, and an hour before the arrival the sky was overcast. It was rather cold, and the hall windows were spattered with drops. "Light the fire in here," said Neville heavily to Masterson as the butler came in to announce that he supposed tea would not be put on the pavilion after all. Neville was sunk in a chair, with his arms dangling down. Aunt Anna was standing up. She had just said she must be going. "My dear boy," remonstrated Anna. Neville groaned. "Yes, I'm behaving disgracefully, aren't I, Masterton? I'm a sulky brute." "Do you wish the fire to be lighted, Sir Neville?" asked Masterson with a dangerous calm. "Yes." "Then I will inform Charles, Sir Neville," said Masterson yet more icily. A conscience-stricken silence followed him out into the passage. "Oh, Lord," said Neville, "now Masterson's offended. You are all in a conspiracy. How am I supposed to know whose business it is to light the beastly fire?" "You're not fit to have any servants," remarked Aunt Anna. "Aunt, I shall burst into tears if you speak to me like that. Go away. Leave me to myself. I shall be stronger soon." Anna was finding it quite hard to keep entirely composed. She could not have conceived that it would be so difficult to behave well, after all the time she had had to get ready. She assured herself that jealousy was absolutely the last of all the emotions that could possibly affect her. It was incredible that she could be jealous. No, it was simple anxiety that Neville should have chosen well. She cared for nothing else so much as that. But she found it rather a relief to take him at his word. "Yes, I shall certainly go away," she said, "after that exhibition. Besides, I got 100 things to see to. You said tulips for tonight at dinner, didn't you?" "I think tulips," said Neville. "Oh, I am so frightened, Aunt Anna. Suppose she thinks it all perfectly beastly. I wish I hadn't bragged so much about the house. And why did I send those picture postcards? Picture postcards idealize so terribly. Suppose she says I've decided her. Oh, by the way, before you go." "Yes." "Don't forget about her mother. Engage her in conversation. Just start her on anything. It doesn't matter in the least what. You've never been to Corfu, have you?" "Corfu? No. Why?" "That'll do just as well. Tell her you haven't been there and ask her what it's like. She's great on Corfu." "Why do you want her to talk about Corfu? I don't understand a word you're saying." "Oh, you're not clever today, Aunt Anna. Why, I want to talk to Enid, of course. What do you suppose I've asked her here for? But clergymen'll do just as well, if you've any objections to Corfu. She's tremendous on clergymen. Do you know any?" "I once knew an archdeacon," said Anna meditatively. "He'll do perfectly. Was he an evangelical archdeacon?" "I haven't the slightest idea. What difference does that make?" "Oh, evangelical ones are her sort. Did he have whiskers?" "I forget." "Well, it's very important to remember, because if he hadn't, he's sure to have been High Church, and she can't bear those. For goodness sake, don't go and put your foot in it, Aunt Anna, and mix up High Church and evangelical. The difference is vital, I understand. Vital. I don't know what would happen if you went and mixed them up. I don't indeed. Oh dear, I feel so miserable. Where's Jim?" "Jim's out in the rain with the collies." "Don't let them jump up on Enid, will you, when they come in? Mrs. Bessington doesn't matter so much. Yes, on second thoughts, I think you might let them jump up on Mrs. Bessington. That would start her all right. By George, I think she was bitten by one once. Or was it her cousin who lives in Corfu? Anyhow, that's not material. It'll do anyhow, yes. Mind you encourage the collies to jump up on Mrs. Bessington's dress with all their muddy paws. Don't forget, will you?" Tulips, Corfu, clergyman, not high church, collies, cousin. Any more orders? No, that's enough for the present, my dear aunt. Oh, you are a dear." She moved away rather quickly as he turned towards her. Her whole soul seemed to knit tight in some strange emotion. She simply could not have touched him just then. "Where are you going?" "Tulips," she said, and went swiftly through the door that led to the servants' quarters. Subsection 2. She was behind her window curtains as the carriage drove up, and utterly ashamed of herself, she watched intently as the door of the brougham opened. Then she saw Neville's curly head in the rain, and then two female figures emerge. Then all three vanished swiftly into the porch. She thought she would give them 10 minutes. Her rosary took her 10 minutes, so she lifted this from her prie-dieu and knelt down with it in her hands. Then she found herself after 3 or 4 decades contemplating the agony in the garden, and stopped. Then she bowed her head on her hands and clenched those until they grew as white as bone. Then she went to the mirror with her sponge in her hands, looked at her face carefully, passed the sponge over her eyes 2 or 3 times, opened the door, and went out. It was the guard at Victoria who looked so extraordinarily like my Uncle Henry, not the guard of our train, but the one who was looking after the train labeled Crystal Palace, at the next platform, with his beard cut quite square. You remember Enid, don't you? Such were the words Aunt Anna heard as she passed round the gallery and began to come downstairs. Then the angle cut off the distinctness of the speaker's words, but the mumble went steadily on. She bit her lower lip fiercely to keep back her laughter. She felt a little hysterical. She knew now that she understood all about Corfu and clergymen. As she came down the last flight, the three looked up all together and stopped talking. She felt like a child at her first party, overwhelmed with shyness. She heard Neville saying something, and the next instant felt her hand grasped, and saw the kindly eyes of a middle-aged woman looking into her own. Then, still more confused, she released her hands and turned and found herself face to face with Enid. For a moment she hesitated. Her swift woman's wit took in, not indeed every detail, but the effect of the whole. It was a splendid pale face, crowned with masses of hair under a big hat, and the face was lit by a pair of radiant eyes. A thin silk mantle hung from the shapely shoulders. Then Aunt Anna put out her hands and felt the girl's hands in hers, drew the girl to herself, and, without a word, kissed her slowly on the lips. It was what she had decided upstairs to do if it were at all possible when the moment came. "It really is a shame," she heard herself saying presently, "that the weather should be like this. Neville had given orders for a completely different sort of day, and tea in the pavilion, and it is, oh, look at that fire!" Indeed, the fire seemed very feeble indeed. She took down a pair of bellows and kneeled before it. "Oh, Aunt Anna!" she heard Neville's voice begin. She was recovering herself finely now. Give her 30 seconds more at the bellows, and she would be all right. "There!" she said, and stood up again. "I think it's perfectly glorious," said Enid. Oh, yes, indeed, she was lovely, thought Aunt Anna. She was standing and looking slowly round the great hall. There could be no question at all about her beauty. The photograph had not lied. "Neville," said the girl, and at the name Aunt Anna set her teeth like a vice. "Neville, you never gave me the slightest idea." "That's all right, then," said Neville. "But the pavilion's the point, you know. Aunt Anna. Where are you going, Aunt Anna?" "Only to ring for tea, my dear. I can't think why they haven't brought it up." As she came back, Mrs. Bessington moved slowly towards her. "I was telling Neville, you won't mind my calling him that, will you, my dear? You see, well, I was telling him about the guard, that it was so like my Uncle Henry. It was when we were at Victoria Station. The hunt was up." Anna recognized it in a moment, and with the deepest relief. She would not be required to say anything. She knew the type. Very tactfully, she steered Mrs. Bessington to a tall chair and maneuvered her into it and herself into another close by the tea table. The Crystal Palace was the subject by the time that tea came in, and Mrs. Bessington was relating the first occasion on which she had taken Enid there, quite 12 years ago, when Enid was only a little dot, and so on. Aunt Anna ministered the tea admirably. She put in the hot water at the right time. She remembered to put in Neville's cream before the tea. She even succeeded in learning whether the two guests wanted sugar. Interminably the affair went on. Little by little the two others seemed to disappear from her range of vision. Now and then their voices were heard across the gentle torrent in her own ears. Now and again they were silent. 2 or 3 minutes ago the voices sounded quite far off, and she caught Lady Brighton's name. Evidently Neville was showing her the portraits. Then there followed a long silence. Mrs. Bessington was talking about coffee now. "Did you say Corfu?" asked Anna, as she desperately and recklessly turned round away from Mrs. Bessington. The hall was empty. The two others were gone. She had played her part nobly. "No, my dear, coffee. But what about Corfu? I was there once, in 1889, and in the spring of 1890. I was there in the year that..." Subsection 3. The garden was exquisite as spring itself, after the rain. By a swift caprice, while Mrs. Bessington was discoursing, and the two lovers were edging slowly round the portraits, the wind had dropped, the sun looked out, and the rain stopped. And when the two, with infinite and careful discretion, slipped out upon the balustraded platform above the steps, the whole place shone and sparkled like a fairy's dream. "Oh," said Enid, and sighed once deeply. "Come down quietly," whispered Neville, "or they'll hear us." The lawn was wet, so it was obvious that they must pass along the path by the house and right round so as to get to the pavilion. "What's that?" asked Enid suddenly, as a bell rang 3 strokes and was silent again. "Angelus," said Neville. "Father Richardson rings it himself at 5. "That's the chaplain, isn't it?" "Yes." The girl looked at him as they turned across towards the terrace. "You don't like him. I thought so in Rome," she said. "That won't do a bit. One ought to like people." "I suppose that is so," said Neville dispassionately. "I shall make friends," she said. "I'll manage him. What's he been doing?" "Oh, well, I suppose one might call it being tiresome." "Well, if you won't, you won't," said Enid. "My dear girl, I am much too angry. Let's talk about something else. There you are. There's the pavilion." If ever the coast could be clear, Father Richardson had thought it would surely be for at least an hour after the arrival of guests. He had seen the brougham drive up from the presbytery window. He had finished his own tea and rung the Angelus, and it had occurred to him while he was doing so that here was an evident opportunity for him to look in the pavilion for a little pocketbook which he was convinced he must have left there a day or 2 before, when he had gone across to see Mrs. Fanning about some small matter connected with the chapel flowers. The guests had scarcely come, he thought. The garden was wet. It was obvious that he would interrupt nothing and nobody. He wasted a few minutes searching the presbytery once more for his book, and then, without misgiving, slipped out through the back gate of the presbytery and went across the gardens. He went rather quickly with his head down, straight up the steps of the pavilion, and stood confounded. "Good evening, Father," said Neville. The priest's eyes wandered past him to the beautiful girl who sat in the window seat. Neville was standing, but it was sufficiently plain that he had also been sitting on the window seat until he heard the steps. "I beg your pardon, Sir Neville. I had no idea. I came to look for a book I think I must have left here." Again his eyes moved round as if searching for his book, and again they rested an instant on the girl's face. Neville hesitated a moment. "May I introduce you to Miss Bessington?" he said. "Father Richardson." The girl bowed a little. "I saw your church as I came up," she said. What a charming place you have here." Yes," said Father Richardson. "I am staying a few days," said the girl. "I wonder if I may come and see the church. I am not a Catholic, Father, but I know Rome very well." "I shall be delighted," said the priest. There fell a little pause. "Well, the book," said Neville. "We mustn't keep you, Father." The book was searched for and was not found. The priest apologized once more and departed. "He looks very nice," said Enid. "I wish you'd tell me why you don't like him." Neville sat down by her. He felt entirely annoyed. This perpetual running in and out of the priest, as if the place belonged to him, as Neville expressed it to himself, was beginning to get on his nerves. What in the world was the use of leaving a scathing message with Masterson if the man simply walked through without question? Yet he hesitated, with the habitual reserve of his class and his religion, to discuss him openly even with Enid. "He's just rather trying, my dear. He gets on my nerves." "You mustn't let him. Does he come and go just as he pleases all over the place?" "That's exactly the point," burst out Neville. "At least it's one of them. He's got his own presbytery in his garden and the whole park. Yet that doesn't seem enough. He doesn't seem to understand." Enid smiled a little. "Poor dear man," she said. "He simply doesn't know. I'll make friends with him and then—" "My darling, that's exactly what I don't want. We've been too good to him already." Enid's eyes narrowed a little, with gentle laughter. "Well, you'll see," she said. "By the way, does he know about—" "Not a word. At least I haven't told him. I've sent nothing to the papers either, you know, as you told me." "Well, look here," said Enid. "I foresee all kinds of difficulties if he doesn't know. Tell him this evening, will you? And then I'll go and see the church tomorrow morning, if I may. That'll all be open and straightforward then. You don't know how to manage him, I expect." She smiled again at her lover.